Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. This week we are reading Part 5 of The Manitou by Graham Masterton, a darn near perfect example of vintage 70s pulp horror fiction. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 8, Over the Blackness. Miss Quimacus was sitting heavily in the center of the room, supporting his deformed bulk on one arm. All the furniture in the room, which looked like a lecture theater, had been tossed aside as if by a violent wind. The floor was cleared, and Miss Quimacus had marked it out with chalk. There was a wide circle, and inside it, Miss Quimacus had drawn dozens of Kabbalistic symbols and figures. The reincarnated magician had his left hand raised over the circle, and he was chanting something in hoarse, insistent whispers. It wasn't the circle and the casting of spells that terrified me, though. It was the dim, half-transparent outline that appeared and disappeared in the center of the circle, an outline of trickling blue light and shifting shapes. Shielding my eyes, I made out a curious toad-like shape that seemed to writhe and vanish, change and melt. Singing Rock stepped softly across the corridor and joined me at the window. He took one look and said, "Gitche Manitou, protect us! Gitche Manitou, shield us from harm! Gitche Manitou, ward off our enemies!" "What is it?" I hissed. "What's going on?" Singing Rock finished his incantation before he answered me. "Oh, Gitche Manitou, afford us help. Oh, Gitche Manitou, save us from injury. Give us luck and good fortune all our moons." "Singing Rock, what is it?" Singing Rock pointed to the hideous, distorted shape of the toad being. "It's the star beast, which is about the nearest translation I can manage. I have never seen it before, only in drawings, and from what old wonder-workers have told me, I didn't think that even Miss Quimacus would dare summon that." "Why?" I whispered. "What's so dangerous about it?" "The star beast is not particularly dangerous in itself. It could destroy you without even thinking about it, but it isn't powerful or supreme. It's more like a servant to the higher beings, a go-between." "You mean that Miss Quimacus is using it like a messenger to call on other demons?" Singing Rock said, "Something like that. I'll tell you later. Right now, I think we'd be well advised to get out of here." "The virus. What about the virus? Singing Rock, we have to take a chance and use it." Singing Rock moved away from the door. "Forget the virus. It was a clever idea, but it isn't going to work. Not now, anyway. Come on, let's go." I stayed where I was. I was terrified, but if there was any chance of destroying Miss Quimacus, I wanted to do it. "Singing Rock, we can threaten him with it. Tell him that if he doesn't close that gateway, we'll kill him. For God's sake, it's worth a try." Singing Rock came back to the door and tried to pull me away. "It's too late," he whispered. "Don't you realize what those demons are? They're a form of virus in themselves. The star beast will laugh at your influenza and give you the worst death you can think of. Miss Quimacus may be threatened, Harry, but once he's summoned these demons, it's too late. It's more dangerous to kill him now than ever. If one of these beasts come through and Miss Quimacus dies, then there is absolutely no way of sending it back. Look at it, Harry. You want to risk that being loose in Manhattan?" The star beast rippled and shimmered in its own ghastly fluorescence. Sometimes it seemed to be fat and glutinous, and at other times it seemed to be composed of nothing but sinuous clouds. It gave off an indescribable atmosphere of freezing terror, like a mad and vicious dog. "It's no good, Singing Rock," I told him. "I have to try." Singing Rock said, "Harry, I can't warn you enough. It's no use." But I had made up my mind. I put my hand on the ice-cold handle of the door and prepared to open it. "Give me a spell or something to cover me," I said. "Harry, a spell isn't a 6-gun. Just don't go, that's all." For the space of 2 seconds, I wondered just what the hell I was doing. I am not the stuff from which heroes are usually made, but I had the means to destroy Misquamacus and the opportunity, and somehow it seemed easier and more logical to try and kill him than it did to let him go. If there was anything worse than the Star Beast, I didn't want to see it, and the only way to stop any more manifestations was to get rid of the medicine man. I counted to 3 and flung open the door. I was not at all prepared for what it was like in there. It was so cold that it was like being in a dark refrigerator, and somehow, as I tried to rush forward, my legs could only move in slow motion, and whole minutes seemed to pass as I waded through the gluey air, my arm upraised with the glass vial of virus, and my eyes wide. It was the sound that was the worst, though. It was like a terrible, chill, depressing wind, a note that was constantly falling, and yet which never sank below a dull, rushing monotone. There was no wind at all in the room, but that intangible hurricane screamed and roared and blotted out all sense of time and space. Misquamacus turned toward me, slowly, like a man in a nightmare. He made no attempt to ward me off or to protect himself. The Star Beast, only yards away in the center of the frosty gateway, shifted and pulsated like coils of toad spawn or twists of smoke. "Misquamacus!" I shrieked. The words came out of my mouth like slow drips of melting wax and seemed to freeze in midair. "Misquamacus!" I stopped only 2 or 3 feet away from him. I had to hold one hand against my ear to try and blot out the deafening moan of the wind that wasn't there. But in my other hand I gripped the infected vial of influenza and held it up above me like a holy crucifix. "Misquamacus, this is the invisible spirit which struck down your people. I have it here, in this bottle. Close the gateway, send back the Star Beast, or I will release it." Somewhere in the back of my brain, I heard Singing Rock shouting, "Harry, come back!" But the hurricane was too loud, and my adrenaline was pumping too fast, and I knew that if I didn't push Misquamacus to the brink, we might never rid ourselves of the Wonder Worker, or his demons, or any of the fearful legacy from a magical past. But I'm a clairvoyant, not a medicine man, and what happened next was something I just couldn't cope with. I felt something cold and wriggly in the palm of my hand. When I looked up at the vial, it had turned into a black, squirming leech. I almost dropped it in disgust, but then a small warning in my mind said, "It's an illusion, another of Misquamacus's tricks," and I held it tight instead. As I gripped it, though, the Wonder Worker outmaneuvered me. The vial appeared to burst into flames, and my brain wasn't fast enough to override my nervous responses and reassure me that this was an illusion, too. I dropped the vial, and it sank slowly toward the floor, unnaturally slowly, like a stone sinking in transparent oil. Terrified, I tried to turn away and run for the door, but the air was heavy and limpid, and every step was congealed into a massive effort. I saw Singing Rock in the doorway, his hands stretched out toward me, but he seemed to be miles and miles distant, a lifesaver on a shore I couldn't reach. The writhing, colorless shape of the Star Beast had an irresistible attraction all its own. I felt myself being physically drawn away from the door and back toward the center of the magic gateway, even though I was using all my strength to try and escape. I saw the vial of influenza virus literally change course in mid-fall and move through the air toward the Star Beast, tumbling and turning like a satellite falling through space. Intense cold dropped itself over me, and in the dinge-like din of that windless wind, I saw my breath forming clouds of vapor and stars of frost collecting on my coat. The vial of virus froze into crystals of glass and ice, which rendered it as harmless to Misquamacus as an empty gun. I turned I couldn't help turning to look at the star beast behind me. Even though I was struggling across the room away from the gateway, my steps took me no further in the direction of the door. My feet were now only inches away from the chalked circle, and within the center of the circle, the horrifying tangle of disturbed air that constituted the star beast was drawing me nearer. Misquamacus, his head lowered and his left arm raised, was intoning a long and deafening chant that appeared to excite the star beast even more. The monster was like the shadowy X-ray of a stomach, churning and twitching in digestive peristalsis. I had been fighting to escape, but the cold was so bitter that it was difficult to think about anything else except how good it would be to get warm. My muscles ached with the frosty clutch of 0 degrees and below, and the effort of running through the moaning gale and the oil-thick air was almost beyond me. I knew that I would probably have to surrender, and that whatever Misquamacus had in store for me, I would have to accept. I remember I dropped to my knees. Singing Rock was screaming at me from the doorway. "Harry!" he yelled. "Harry, don't give up!" I tried to lift my head to look at him. My neck muscles seemed to be frozen, and the hoarfrost on my eyebrows and hair was so thick that I could hardly see anything at all. My hair was laden with frost, and there was a beard of icicles around my nose and mouth where my breath had frozen. I felt nothing but a distant Arctic numbness, and all I could hear was the terrifying rush of that wind. "Harry!" screamed Singing Rock. "Harry, move! Harry, move!" I raised my hand. I tried to struggle to my feet again. Somehow I managed to pull myself a few inches from the gateway, but the star beast was far too strong for me, and the magic charms of Misquamacus held me like a weakly flapping fish in a net. There was an electric typewriter, its keys thick with ice, lying on its side on the floor. It suddenly occurred to me that if I threw something like that at Misquamacus, or maybe at the star beast itself, it would give me a few seconds' diversion to pull myself free. That was how little I knew about the powers of occult beings. I was still treating them like cowboys and Indians. I reached out my frost-bitten hands and lifted the typewriter up with tremendous effort. It had so much ice on it, it was nearly twice its normal weight. I turned, I rolled over, and I hurled the typewriter toward the magic gateway and the dim outline of the star beast. Like everything else in this occult environment, it flew in a long, slow-motion arc, turning over and over as it flew, and it seemed to take an age to reach the circle. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just lay there, frozen stiff and bunched up like a fetus, waiting for the moment when the tumbling typewriter would reach the beast. I think I closed my eyes. I might have even slept for a moment. When you're freezing cold, all you can think of is sleep and warmth and giving in. The typewriter reached the restless outline of the star beast, and then something extraordinary happened. In a glittering burst of metal and plastic, the typewriter exploded, and for a vivid second I saw something within that explosion. It vanished without a trace, but it was like an aggressive, disembodied snarl. It had no shape and no form at all, but it left a fading mental image on the back of my eye, like a flash photograph taken in the dark. The star beast cringed. Its serpentine coils and clouds seemed to roll back on themselves like a ghostly sea anemone. The mournful wind rose and fell in an odd, disturbed shriek, and I knew that if I was ever going to get away, it would have to be now. I heaved myself onto my feet and scrambled for the door. I didn't look back, but I almost collided with Singing Rock, and the next thing I knew I was sitting blindly in the corridor outside, and the door was firmly shut. Singing Rock was making protective signs on the door to keep Misquamacus temporarily imprisoned. "You're crazy," said Singing Rock. "You're absolutely crazy." I rubbed the melting frost from my hair. "I'm still alive, though, and I did have a go at Misquamacus." Singing Rock shook his head. You didn't stand a chance. If I hadn't bombarded Miss Quimacus with protective spells, you'd have been fried fish by now." I coughed and looked up. "I know that, Singing Rock, and thanks, but I still had to try it. That star beast is so cold. I feel like I just walked 20 miles in a blizzard." Singing Rock stood up and looked through the door. "Miss Quimacus doesn't seem to be moving. The beast is gone now. I think it's time we got out of here ourselves." "What are we going to do?" I asked, as Singing Rock helped me onto my feet. "More to the point, what do you think Miss Quimacus is going to do?" Singing Rock shone the flashlight behind us for a brief instant, just to make sure that we weren't being followed. Then he said, "I've got a pretty good idea of what Miss Quimacus is up to, and I think the best thing we can do is get ourselves out of here. If he's doing what I think he's doing, life is going to become distinctly unhealthy around here. But we can't just leave him. I don't know what else we can do. He's not making his magic as consistently and strongly as he should, but he's still too powerful to touch." We walked quickly down the corridors toward the elevator. It was dark and silent on the 10th floor, but our footsteps seemed muffled, like men running on soft grass. I was panting by the time we reached the last corner and saw the welcome door of the elevator, still open and waiting for us. I dislodged my shoes from the door, and we pressed the button for 18. We lay back against the elevator walls in relief and felt ourselves being carried upward to safety. There was quite a reception committee waiting for us when we stepped out into the bright light of the 18th floor. Dr. Winsome had called in the police, and there were 8 or 9 armed officers standing around among the doctors and male nurses. The newspapers were there too, and CBS television was just setting up their cameras. As we emerged from the elevator, there was a hubbub of questions and exclamations, and it was all I could do to push my way through. Jack Hughes was sitting in the corner with his hand heavily bandaged. He looked pale and sick, and there was a male nurse with him, but he had obviously refused to be sent off the battlefield. "How is it?" he asked me. "What's happening down there?" Dr. Winsome, redder than ever, pushed his way forward and said, "I had to call the police, Mr. Erskine. It seems to me there are people's lives at risk. I had to do it for the safety of all concerned. This is Lieutenant Marino, and I think he wants to ask you some questions." Behind Dr. Winsome, I saw the now familiar face of Lieutenant Marino, with his hard smile and his brush-cut hair. I waved, and he nodded back. "Mr. Erskine," he said, pushing his way closer. There were 5 or 6 newspaper reporters clustered all around us, with their notebooks out, and the television people had just switched on their glaring lights. "I just want to know a few details, Mr. Erskine." "Can we talk somewhere private?" I asked. "This is hardly the place." Lieutenant Marino shrugged. "The press are going to get a hold of it sooner or later. Just tell us what's going on. Dr. Winsome here says you have a violent patient. Apparently he's already killed 1 man, injured this doctor here, and he's planning to kill some more." I nodded. "Well, yes, that's true, in a way." "In a way? What's that supposed to mean?" "He's not exactly a patient, and he didn't kill that man in the normal sense of murdering him. Look, it's impossible telling you now. Let's find ourselves a private office or something." Marino looked around at the press and the TV cameras and the policemen and medics and said, "Okay, if it's going to make it easier, Dr. Winsome, is there an office we can use?" The press groaned in disappointment and started to argue about their right to know the facts, but Lieutenant Marino was firm. I called Singing Rock, and together we locked ourselves with Lieutenant Marino and his deputy, Detective Naro, in a ward nurse's office. The press clustered around the door outside, and we spoke quickly and quietly so that they wouldn't hear. "Lieutenant," I said, "we have a very difficult situation here, and I don't know how to explain it to you." Lieutenant Marino parked his feet on the desk and took out a lark. "Try me," he said, lighting up. "Well, it's like this. The man down there on the 10th floor is a homicidal maniac. He's an Indian, and he's seeking revenge on the whites." Lieutenant Marino coughed. "Go on," he said patiently. The only problem is he's not a normal man. He has certain powers and abilities that ordinary people don't have. Like he's able to leap tall buildings at a single bound? Asked Lieutenant Marino. Faster than a speeding bullet? Singing Rock laughed without amusement. You're nearer to the truth than you think, Lieutenant. You mean you got Superman down there? I sat up, trying my darndest to look sincere and believable. It sounds ludicrous, Lieutenant, but that's almost what we do have. The Indian down there is a medicine man, and he's using his magical powers in order to seek his revenge. Singing Rock here is a medicine man himself, of the Sioux, and he's been helping us cope. He's already saved several lives, and I think you ought to listen to what he has to say. Lieutenant Marino took his feet off the desk and turned around to look at Singing Rock. He puffed at his cigarette for a few moments, and then he said, Some detectives like wacky cases, you know? I mean, some detectives go out of their way to solve these real eccentric mysteries and stuff like that. Do you know what I like? I like open and shut homicides. Victim, motive, weapon, conviction. So do you know what I get? Wacky cases. That's what I get. Singing Rock raised his lacerated cheek. Does this look wacky? He asked Lieutenant Marino quietly. Lieutenant Marino said nothing and shrugged. Singing Rock said, I'm going to tell you this straight because we don't have very much time, and even if you don't believe me now, you will when things start to happen. My friend here is right. The man downstairs is an Indian medicine man. I won't stretch your imagination too far and tell you how he got here or what he's doing on the 10th floor of a private hospital, but I can tell you that his powers are quite real and highly dangerous. Is he armed? Asked Detective Naro, a young, neatly dressed cop in a blue suit and blue check shirt. Not with guns, said Singing Rock. He doesn't need to be. His magical powers are far more effective than guns. What's more, your guns will be quite useless against him and potentially dangerous to yourselves. If I can't impress anything else on you, let me convince you of that. Please, no guns. Lieutenant Marino raised his eyebrows. What do you suggest we use as an alternative? Bow and arrow? Singing Rock frowned. Your humor is a little out of line, Lieutenant. There's nothing funny about what's happening downstairs, and you're going to need all the help and all the information you can get. Well, said Lieutenant Marino, what is happening downstairs? It's not easy to understand, said Singing Rock. I'm not even sure of this myself, but here's the way I read it right now. Miss Quimacus, the medicine man, is preparing a magical gateway to summon Indian demons and spirits from the other side. The other side of what? The other side of physical existence, the spirit world. He's already managed to conjure up the star beast, which is the servant and messenger of the great hierarchy of red Indian demons. Mr. Erskine here, well, he saw the star beast with his own eyes and nearly died. Lieutenant Marino said, Is that true, Mr. Erskine? I nodded. It's true, I swear it. Look at the state of my hands. Lieutenant Marino peered at my blue and blotchy patches of frostbite and said nothing. Singing Rock said, It isn't easy for any medicine man to conjure up beings from beyond. They're pitiless, dangerous, and powerful. Most of the greater beings from Red Indian history are sealed off from us by ancient locks and spells that were imposed on them before the white man even placed one foot on our continent. The medicine men who locked them away in the spirit world were masters of their craft, and there isn't a single spiritual wonder worker alive today who can match them. That's why these Manitous are so perilous. If Miss Quimacus releases them, there is no one who can send them back. I'm not even sure that Miss Quimacus could send them back himself. Detective Naro was confused. He said, These beings, do you mean they're hiding in the building? Singing Rock shook his head. They are all around us, in the air we breathe, in the woods and rocks and trees. Everything has its Manitou, its spirit. There are natural Manitous of the skies and the earth and the rains, and there are Manitous in everything that is made or created by man. Every Indian lodge has its Manitou. Every Indian weapon had its Manitou. Why do some bows shoot straight and others crooked? It depends on the faith of the man who holds the bow and the sympathy he has for the Manitou of his weapon. That is why your guns would be so dangerous to you. A gun has a Manitou, according to whatever faith and craft has been invested in it. But your men do not believe that, and the Manitous of their own weapons could quite easily be turned against them. Lieutenant Marino was still listening, but he was looking more and more miserable with every word that Singing Rock spoke. Detective Naro was trying to keep up with it, but it was plain that he believed that Miss Climacus was a criminal maniac with a hidden gang. In Detective Naro's life, spirits and insubstantial shades from netherworlds just didn't exist. I wish to God that they didn't exist in mine, Singing Rock said. From the gateway that Miss Climacus is preparing, I think that he is calling on the most terrible of all spirits, the Great Old One. Lieutenant Marino said, "The Great Old One? Who is the Great Old One?" "He is the equivalent to your Satan or devil. Gitche Manitou is the great spirit of life and red Indian creation, but the Great Old One is his constant enemy. There are many accounts of the Great Old One in ancient Indian writings, although none of them agree what he looked like or how he could be summoned. Some say he looked like a huge toad, the size of several pigs, and others say he looked like a cloud with a face made of snakes." Lieutenant Marino sniffed. "Kinda hard to send out an APB on that description." Singing Rock nodded. "You wouldn't get the opportunity, Lieutenant. The Great Old One is the most ravenous and hideous of all demons. I have said that he's like your Satan, but Satan, by comparison, is a gentleman. The Great Old One is a being of infinite cruelty and malevolence." There was a long silence. Finally, Lieutenant Marino stood up and adjusted his revolver in his belt. Detective Naro closed his notebook and buttoned up his coat. "Thank you for your information and your assistance," said Lieutenant Marino. "Now I think we'll go catch ourselves a homicide." Singing Rock said, "Lieutenant, you're not taking your gun." Marino simply smiled. "Your stories about demons and all that stuff are very imaginative, Mr. Singing Rock, but I have a homicide squad to run. The hospital has asked us to winkle out a mad patient who's already killed one nurse and injured a doctor, and it's my duty to go down there and get him out, dead or alive, you understand, depending on how he wants it. What did you say his name was? Mickey something?" "Miss Climacus," corrected Singing Rock quietly. "Lieutenant, I'm warning you." "Warn me no warns," said Lieutenant Marino. "I've been serving this force for longer than a coon's age, and I know what to do in situations like this one. There won't be no trouble, and there won't be no fuss. Just keep your heads down until it's all over." He opened the office door, and the press and the TV people came pushing in. Singing Rock and I stood amongst them, silent and depressed and frightened, while Marino gave a tough 2-minute resume of what he planned to do. "We're going to seal off the whole floor, then comb the corridors with marksmen and tear gas. We're going to do it real systematic, and we're going to issue regular warnings to this nut that if he doesn't come quiet, he's in genuine trouble. I'm also sending 3 men down in the elevator to cut him off from that direction." The reporters scribbled down Marino's plan and then bombarded him with more questions. Marino raised his hands for silence. "I'm not saying anything else for now. Just watch how we flush him out, and then we'll chew the fat later. Is everyone ready, Detective?" "Ready, sir," said Naro. We watched despondently as a squad of 8 armed patrolmen went to the staircase and disappeared through the door. Lieutenant Marino was standing by the elevator with his handheld intercom, checking for the moment when the search and destroy team would reach the 10th floor. 3 men, 2 uniformed officers and Detective Naro, were waiting by the elevator, revolvers ready, all keyed up for the moment to go down there and shoot it out. After 9 or 10 minutes of restless waiting, there was a buzz from the men down below. "How are you doing down there?" called Lieutenant Marino through the intercom. There was a crackle of static. Then a voice said, "It's dark. We can't get the lights to work. We may need some floods." "Are you into the corridor yet?" asked Lieutenant Marino. "Can you see anything?" "We're just through the door and we're ready to fan out and start looking. No sign of any trouble so far." Lieutenant Marino gave a thumbs up to Detective Naro and his 2 uniformed buddies, and they entered the elevator and pressed the button for 10. Singing Rock and I didn't look at each other as the doors slid shut and the floor indicator blinked 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, and down. It stopped at 10. "How you guys doing?" asked Marino into his intercom. "We're fine," came the voice of the search and destroy leader. "So far there's nothing to report. We're going through every room, one after the other, and we're checking everything." "Keep alert," said Marino. Detective Naro's voice, distorted by the intercom, said, "It's very dark indeed. The flashlights don't seem to work properly. Does anyone know what's wrong with the lights?" Dr. Winsome said, "We've already checked. There's no fault that we can detect." Lieutenant Marino said, "They say the lights have been checked and they can't help. Just be careful and hold your flashlights away from your body. You don't want to make yourself an easy target." I whispered to Singing Rock, shaking my head, "They still think they're fighting a mad gunman." Singing Rock was very pale. "They'll find out," he said grimly. "I just hope it isn't too bad when they do." The voice of the search and destroy leader said, "I'm having some trouble here. The floor plan of these corridors doesn't seem to tally with the maps. We've been around in a circle twice, and it looks like we're just about to do it for the 3rd time." "Illusions," said Singing Rock softly. A newspaper reporter with carroty hair looked up and said, "What?" "What's your position?" asked Lieutenant Marino. "What room is nearest to you?" "Room 1005, sir." Lieutenant Marino hurriedly consulted his floor plan. Then he said, "In that case, there should be a turning to your left and then a right, and you're into the next section." There was a brief silence, and then the voice said, "Sir, there's no turning. I mean, there's no opening. This is just a blank wall here. I can't see anything." "That's nonsense, Peterson. There's a turning right in front of you." "Sir, there's no turning. They must have changed the place around since these maps were drawn." Lieutenant Marino turned around to Dr. Winsome, but Dr. Winsome simply shook his head. Lieutenant Marino said, "The hospital people say no. Are you sure that's 1005? "Affirmative, sir." "We'll keep on looking. There's probably been some kind of mistake. Maybe the suspect changed the room numbers around." "Sir?" "Well, I don't know. Just keep looking." At that moment there was a buzz from Detective Naro. His voice sounded oddly hoarse and strained. "I seem to think we have trouble here, sir." "What kind of trouble?" rapped Lieutenant Marino. "Did you locate the suspect?" "Sir, we're having some kind of a—" "Naro, you're having some kind of a what?" "Sir, we're—" The intercom crackled for a moment and then went dead. For a brief moment I heard the mournful monotone of that wind that blew and didn't blow at all. Then there was silence. Lieutenant Marino pressed his call button. "Naro? Detective Naro, can you hear me? Naro, what's going on down there?" There was a buzz from the search team. Marino said, "Yes?" "Sir, we seem to have run into something here. It's extremely cold down here. I don't think I've ever been anywhere quite so cold." "Cold? What the hell are you talking about?" "It's cold, sir. It's so cold. I think we're going to have to turn back. The flashlights won't work. It's very dark and it's very cold, sir, and I don't think we can carry on much longer." Lieutenant Marino jabbed the call button and shouted, "Stay down there! What the hell's wrong with you people? What the hell's going on down there?" There was silence. For the first time, in that room full of newsmen and cameramen and medics, there was silence. Then, Almost imperceptibly, we felt the floor rise and fall like a passing wave, and every light in the room flickered briefly. There was a strange sensation like a cloud passing over the sun, and somewhere we heard the dull, nagging sound of a mournful wind. Lieutenant Marino went to the uniformed officer standing by the elevator doors. "Get that elevator up here," he said tightly. "I'm going down to look for myself." The officer pressed the button, and the elevator indicator rose up from 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Lieutenant Marino tugged his police special out of his waistband and stood by the elevator doors ready to step in when they opened. The light on the indicator said 18. There was a hum, and the elevator doors slid back. There was a horrified gasp from everyone in the whole room. The inside of the elevator looked like a butcher's frozen meat store. The hacked and mangled remains of every policeman in the squad lay in a red, hoar-frosted leap. There were rib cages, arms, legs, and torn-apart faces, all thickly rimmed with white crystals. Singing Rock turned away, and I watched him turn away, and I felt as helpless and agonized as he did. Chapter 9. Under the Cloud. Half an hour later, we sat in Jack Hughes' office with Lieutenant Marino and Dr. Winsome, smoking fast and drinking faster, and trying to think our way out of trouble. This time, Singing Rock and Jack Hughes and I were given something more than skeptical disinterest, and we told the police and the doctors everything we knew about Miss Quamacus and the strange dreams of Karen Tandy. I still didn't know if Lieutenant Marino was prepared to believe what we were telling him, but he had a slaughtered squad of police on his hands, and he wasn't in much of a position to argue. The lights had started to flicker more regularly now, and that odd rippling motion of the floor was happening more and more often. Marino had sent out a call for reinforcements, but wherever they were coming from, they certainly seemed to be taking their own sweet time about it. Marino's intercom seemed to be growing fainter and less effective, and there was a persistent crackle on most of the telephones. A young uniformed officer had been sent out of the hospital to call for help on foot, but there was no sign of him either. "All right," said Marino sourly. "Supposing it's magic, supposing all this garbage is true, what do we do about it? How do you arrest a Manitou?" Singing Rock coughed. He was looking tired and strained, and I didn't know how much longer he could keep going. The floor rose and fell underneath us, and the electric lights flickered an odd bluish color. It was like traveling by ship on a heavy swell. The remote, monotonous sound of the star beast's gale added to the impression of a desolate voyage into unknown seas. "I don't know how we can stop Miss Quamacus now," said Singing Rock. "You can feel these vibrations. They're the preliminaries to the appearance of the Great Old One. According to the legends, the Great Old One is always preceded by storms and hideous minions. Dr. Hughes can tell you all about those." Dr. Hughes, without a word, passed over a black and white photograph that had been taken of his mutilated hand. He had disturbed the hospital photographic unit to have it printed up specially. Lieutenant Marino examined it without emotion and then passed it back. "What do you think could have caused damage like that?" asked Dr. Hughes. "Those are sharp, narrow teeth marks. A lion? A leopard? An alligator?" Lieutenant Marino looked up. Dr. Hughes said, "It could have been any of those, but how many lions and alligators are there in Midtown Manhattan?" Lieutenant Marino shook his head. "I don't know, Doctor, and I don't really care. I'm very sorry about your hand. Believe me, I'm very sorry. But I'm a whole lot sorrier about 11 dead cops, and I want to do something about it. Redfern!" A slight, bright-eyed young cop put his head through the door. "Yes, sir? Any sign of those reinforcements yet?" "I've had a call from them, sir, on the RT. They say they're having some trouble getting into the building." "They're what?" "It was Lieutenant Gigahan, sir, from the 17th. He said they would probably have to break down the doors. They can't get them open." Singing Rock and I exchanged glances. It looked as if Miss Quimacus had sealed the hospital off from the outside world. If there was one thing I didn't want to be, it was trapped in a hospital when the great old one made his appearance. Preferably, I wanted to be in New Jersey or even Ohio. I shook my last cigarette out of its pack and lit it with shaking hands. Again the floor swelled, and the lights went so low that the elements fizzed. "Call him again," snapped Marino. "Tell him we're desperate, and they better get their asses in here before the whole shooting match goes up." "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Marino turned back to the meeting. He wasn't enjoying this job, and he wasn't making any pretense that he did. He picked up the bottle of bourbon, poured himself a heavy dose of it, and drank it, with his eyes challenging everyone to say it wasn't for medicinal purposes only. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and said, "Right. I want to know every way there is of destroying that great old one. All the legends, all the bunkum, everything." Singing Rock shook his head. "I can't tell you," he said. "Why not?" "Because there's nothing to tell. There is no way of destroying the great old one. If there was, he would have been annihilated centuries ago by those wonder workers who were far more skillful than us. As it was, they only managed to close the gateway through which he came into the physical world." "And you say this guy, Miss Quimacus, is opening that gateway up again?" Singing Rock shrugged. "Can't you feel these ripples? Do you know what it is?" "Earthquake?" suggested Marino. Singing Rock said, "No, Lieutenant, it's not an earthquake. It's the beginning of a huge buildup of astral energy. I imagine that by now the Star Beast has negotiated terms between Miss Quimacus and the Great Old One, and the Nexus, the gateway, is being made ready. The gateway is made out of extraordinary energy and only remains open for a short while. It takes an equivalent amount of energy to send the Great Old One back to where he came from. Even more, actually, because the Great Old One would be very reluctant to leave." "Sounds hopeful," said Marino sarcastically. Singing Rock said, "We can't give up hope yet. There has to be a way of containing the situation, even if we can't totally destroy Miss Quimacus." I crushed out my cigarette. A thought had occurred to me. I said, "That typewriter I threw at the Star Beast, did you see that?" "Sure," said Singing Rock. "It saved your life." "Well, when it exploded, when it actually touched the Star Beast's outline, I'm sure that I sensed something. It wasn't actually a face or anything as clear as that. It was more like a disembodied expression." Singing Rock nodded. He said, "What you thought you saw was the spirit of the machine, the typewriter's own Manitou. In its conflict with the Star Beast Manitou, it became momentarily visible while expended whatever energy it had. You can rest assured that the Star Beast thoroughly destroyed it." I frowned. "The typewriter had a Manitou?" "Of course," said Singing Rock. "Everything does. A pen, a cup, a piece of paper. There was a greater or lesser spirit in everything." "I think we're getting away from the point," said Lieutenant Marino testily. "What we want to know is, how can we get rid of this great old one?" "Wait," I put in. "This may be relevant. Why did the Manitou of the typewriter come into conflict with the Star Beast? What did they have to fight about?" Singing Rock pulled a face. "I don't really know. The spirits are as much in conflict with each other as human beings. The spirits of the rocks are in conflict with the spirits of the winds and the trees. I guess it could have something to do with ancient sorcery against technology." "What do you mean?" asked Jack Hughes, leaning forward. "Simply that the Star Beast is a very ancient Manitou, from times unknown," explained Singing Rock. "The Manitou of the typewriter is part of the Manitou of human electrical technology. They are bound to come into conflict. The spirit world mirrors the physical world to a remarkable degree." I thought for a while. Then I said, "Supposing we had the technological Manitous on our side, Wouldn't they help us? I mean, they'd be more inclined to support us than Miss Quamacus, wouldn't they? I guess so, said Singing Rock. But what are you getting at? Look, if there's a Manitou in every piece of machinery and human technological creation, we must be able to find a Manitou that's able to assist us. The typewriter Manitou was small and weak, but supposing we found one that was powerful and strong, couldn't that defeat the great old one? Lieutenant Marino rubbed his eyes. This is too much for me, he said tiredly. If I hadn't seen 11 of my own men killed and frozen in front of my eyes, I'd run you straight round to the nut house. Jack Hughes said, What you want is a machine with tremendous power, something overwhelming. A hydraulic power station? I suggested. Singing Rock shook his head. Too risky. The water spirits would obey the command of the great old one and hold back your power. How about an airplane? Or a ship? Same problem, said Singing Rock. We pondered a few more minutes. The floor began to sway even more violently, and pens and paper clips skated off Jack Hughes' desk onto the floor. The lights dimmed, paused, and struggled on again. The floor heaved some more, and Dr. Hughes' single Valentine card tipped over and fluttered under Lieutenant Marino's chair. I began to hear that monotonous wind noise even more distinctly, and there was a denseness, a closeness about the air that made me feel we were all going to suffocate. The heating system may not have worked too well in this office before, but now the place began to grow insufferably hot. Officer Redfern came to the door. He said tensely, They're still trying to break in, sir. They came on the radio and they're still trying. Lieutenant Gigahan said the building looks as if it's swaying or something. He says we got strange blue lights on the 9th or 10th floor. Should I tell the rest of the men to evacuate, sir? Evacuate? Snarled Marino. What for? Well, sir, it's an earthquake, isn't it? In disaster drills, sir, they say you're supposed to evacuate tall buildings. Lieutenant Marino slapped the palm of his hand on the desk. Earthquake? He said bitterly. I wish it damned well was. Just round up 2 or 3 of the guys and see if you can help that idiot Gigahan to get in. Take the stairs and watch out for the 10th floor. Right, sir. Oh, and, sir? Yes, Redfern? Detective Wisbeck told me to say that he's run the M.O. through Unitrack, and so far there's no precedent. No known murderer kills that way, sir. Not by freezing. Lieutenant Marino sighed. All right, Redfern. He turned back to us and said, That's police efficiency for you. 11 men get chopped up and chilled, and we have to run it through a computer to see if anyone ever went around doing things like that before. What the hell is wrong with memories these days? Redfern left with a quick salute. The floor was stirring again, and he looked relieved to have been sent down to street level. What's more, the wind noise was moaning even louder, and how can you explain to people who hear gales blowing that there are no gales, and that the wind is the wind of occult malevolence? Just a minute, said Jack Hughes. How did your detective get in touch with this computer? Lieutenant Marino said, By phone. It's available to all police forces in the state of New York. If there's anything you need to know about missing automobiles, missing persons, crime patterns, anything like that, it can tell you in just a few seconds. Is it a big computer? Sure. Unitrack is one of the largest on the eastern seaboard. Jack Hughes turned to Singing Rock. I think we have found you a technological Manitou, he said. The Unitrack computer. Singing Rock nodded. That sounds more like it, he said. Do you have the phone number, Lieutenant? Lieutenant Marino looked bewildered. Now, wait a minute, he said. That computer is strictly for authorized police personnel only. You need a code to get through. Have you got a code? Asked Singing Rock. Sure, but me no buts, said Singing Rock. If you want to catch the thing that killed your 11 men, then this is the only way to do it. What are you talking about? Snapped Lieutenant Marino. Are you trying to tell me that you can conjure up a spirit out of a police department computer? Why not? Said Singing Rock. I won't say it's going to be easy, but Unitrac's Manitou is bound to be Christian and God-fearing and dedicated to the cause of law and order. Unitrac was made for that purpose. A machine's Manitou cannot go contrary to the underlying intent with which it was fashioned. If I can summon it up, it will be perfect. History will repeat itself. What do you mean, history will repeat itself? Singing Rock rubbed the back of his neck tiredly. This continent and its red Indian spirits were defeated once by the white Manitous of law and Christianity. I expect they can be defeated again. Lieutenant Marino was just reaching for his computer code card when the air seemed to go suddenly still. We looked around at each other uncertainly. The floor had stopped swaying, but now it was vibrating, very faintly, as if someone was drilling their way through concrete, floors and floors beneath us. Way down below in the street, we heard sirens and fire truck horns, and also the sorrowful moan of that magical wind. Abruptly, the lights died. Lieutenant Marino shouted, "Don't move! Nobody move! If anyone moves, I'll shoot!" We stayed frozen like statues, listening and waiting to see if we were being attacked. I felt drops of sweat sliding silently down the side of my face and into my collar. The rooms on the 18th floor were stifling and airless, and it was obvious that the air conditioning had stopped too. I heard them first, rushing and scurrying down the walls like a phantom river. I saw Lieutenant Marino raise his police special in alarm, but he didn't fire. Chilled with fright, we peered through the luminous gloom of the offices and saw them. They were like ghostly rats, torrents and torrents of scampering ghostly rats, and they were pouring down every wall. They emerged from nowhere and disappeared into the floor as if it wasn't solid at all. There must have been millions of them, whispering and rustling and scuttling everywhere in a hideous tide of furry bodies. "What is it?" said Lieutenant Marino. "What are they?" "Exactly what they look like," said Singing Rock. "They are the parasites that accompany the Great Old One. In a spiritual sense, he is verminous, and these are his vermin. It looks as if Miss Cumacus is using the hospital building itself as a gateway to summon the Great Old One, and that's why they're pouring down the walls like that. I expect they're assembling on the 10th floor. After that, well, who knows?" Lieutenant Marino didn't say a word. He simply handed his computer code card to Singing Rock and pointed to the number on it. He seemed to be shocked and numbed, but then we all were. Even the newspaper reporters and the television crew were silent and apprehensive, and we stared at each other with the haunted eyes of men who are trapped in a sinking submarine. Singing Rock went into a small side office and picked up the phone. I stayed with him while he dialed, and I could hear the ringing tone and the click of the recorded answering machine. Squinting closely at Lieutenant Marino's card, Singing Rock read off a series of numbers and waited to be put in touch with Unitrac. "What are you going to do?" I asked him. "How can you tell a computer that you need some help from its Manitou?" Singing Rock lit himself a small cigar and puffed out smoke. "I guess it's going to be a question of using the right language," he said, "and also persuading the programmers that I'm not totally crazy." There was another click, and a matter-of-fact voice said, "Unitrac, could you state your business, please?" Singing Rock coughed. "I'm speaking for Lieutenant Marino of the New York Police Department. Lieutenant Marino would like to know if Unitrac has a spiritual existence." There was a silence. Then the voice said, "What? Would you repeat that?" "Lieutenant Marino would like Unitrac to state if it has a spiritual existence." There was another silence. Then the voice said, "Look, what is this? Is this some kind of a joke? Please, just ask the question." There was a sigh. Unitrac is not programmed to answer questions like that. Unitrac is a working computer, not one of your fancy university poem-writing gadgets. Now, if that's all, Wait, said Singing Rock urgently. Please ask Unitrack one important question. Ask if it has any data on the Great Old One. The Great what? The Great Old One. He's a kind of a criminal ringleader. What division? Fraud, homicide, arson, what? Singing Rock thought for a moment. Then he said, homicide. There was a silence. The voice said, you're spelling great as in great grief? That's correct. Okay, hold on then. Through the receiver, I could hear distant whirs and clicks as Singing Rock's question was punched onto cards. Singing Rock smoked and fidgeted, and in the background we could hear the terrible sound of that spooky wind. The floor stirred again, and Singing Rock covered the mouthpiece with his hand and whispered, I don't think this is going to work. It won't be long now, and the Great Old One will be let through the gateway. I hissed, is there anything else we can do? Any other way of stopping him? Singing Rock said, there must be another way. After all, the ancient wonder workers were able to seal the Great Old One in his own domain. But even if I knew what it was, I don't expect I'd be capable of doing it. As we waited for Unitrack to come up with an answer, I began to feel an odd kind of nausea. At first, I thought it was the swaying and rippling of the hospital floor, but then I realized it was a smell, a ripe, fetid, revolting smell that reminded me of a frozen rabbit I had once bought, which turned out rotten. I sniffed, pulled a face, and looked at Singing Rock. He's coming, said Singing Rock without apparent emotion. The Great Old One is coming. I heard shouting outside, and I left Singing Rock holding on to the telephone and went to see what was going on. There was a crowd of doctors and nurses around the CBS camera. I pushed my way through to Jack Hughes and asked him what had happened. He looked pale and ill, and his hand was obviously hurting him a great deal. It was one of the cameramen, he said. He was holding onto his camera, and it seemed like he just collapsed. He was shaking like he'd had an electric shock, but it isn't that. I struggled forward toward the cameraman. He was young and sandy-haired, dressed in jeans and a red T-shirt. His eyes were closed, and his face was contorted and white. His bottom lip kept shuddering and curling in a strange kind of snarl. One of the interns was rolling up his sleeve to inject him with tranquilizer. What's wrong? I said. Is he having a fit? The intern carefully inserted the hypodermic into the cameraman's arm and squeezed the plunger. After a few moments, the facial spasms and the shuddering seemed to die away, and apart from a few isolated twitches, the cameraman began to calm down. I don't know what it is, said the intern, shaking his head. It looks to me like some kind of severe psychological shock, probably a delayed reaction to everything that's been going on here. Let's get him out of here and try to fix him up more comfortably, called Dr. Winsome. 3 or 4 of the doctors went for a trolley, while the rest of us, frustrated and frightened, dispersed in awkward silence to wait for whatever manifestation was going to make its presence felt on us next. I heard Lieutenant Marino talking angrily on the telephone to his reinforcements, and it was clear that they were still having trouble gaining access to the building. Mingled with the moans of Miss Quimakis's wind, I could hear more sirens howling in the streets outside, and I could see spotlights flickering against the windows. In an hour or 2, it would start to grow light, if we survived long enough to see it. The putrid stench of the Great Old One was thick in the air now, and 2 or 3 people were retching. The temperature kept fluctuating from stifling heat to uncomfortable cold, as if the whole building had a raging and uncontrollable fever. I went back to Singing Rock. He was scribbling down a series of numbers on the corner of a magazine, and he looked intense and anxious. I waited for him to finish, then said, "Do you think you can make it?" Singing Rock examined the figures carefully. "I'm not sure, but there's something here. The computer programmer said that the machine had no police records on anyone, called the Great Old One, and he combed back for 10 years through every known criminal alias. But Unitrack did respond with a message in a series of numbers. What did they say? Well, the programmer translated the message for me, and it says, "Call procedure follows promptly." Then we get the numbers. I wipe my forehead with my stained handkerchief. Does that help? Does that mean anything? I think so, said Singing Rock. At least Unitrack answered. And if it answered, well, maybe it knows what we want. I pointed to the numbers. You mean these numbers tell you how to summon its Manitou? Possibly. We don't know until we try. I sat down warily. Singing Rock, it all sounds too far-fetched for me. I know what I've done and I know what I've seen, but don't tell me that some publicly funded computer is going to tell us how to raise its own spirit. Singing Rock, it just doesn't sound sane. Singing Rock nodded. I know, Harry, and I don't think I believe it any more than you do. All I can say is that the message from Unitrack is here, and that these numbers do tally with the appropriate ritual for summoning the Manitous of man-made objects. In point of fact, it's one of the easiest of rituals. I was taught it by the medicine man, Sarara, of the Paiute. When I was only 12 years old, I learned to raise the Manitous of shoes and gloves and books and all kinds of things. I could make a book turn all its pages without touching it at all. But a book is a book, Singing Rock. This is a multi-million-dollar computer. It's powerful. It could even be dangerous. Singing Rock sniffed the stench of the Great Old One that was already crowding the room. Nothing could be more dangerous than what we are about to experience now, he said. At least if we have to die, we will die a hero's death. A hero's death doesn't interest me. Singing Rock laid his hand on mine. You didn't think of that when you faced the Star Beast alone. No, but I'm thinking of it now. Twice in one night is too much for any man. Singing Rock said, What was all that noise outside? Was someone hurt? I reached for a cigarette from the pack on the desk. It was a cameraman from CBS. He was walking about filming, and he just collapsed. I guess he must have been epileptic or something. Singing Rock frowned. He was filming? That's right. I guess he was just taking shots of everybody in the whole place. He went over like someone had knocked him on the head. Don't ask me. I didn't see it. Singing Rock thought for a moment. Then he walked quickly out of the office and over to the CBS reporters. They were standing in an uneasy circle, 5 or 6 of them, smoking and trying to figure out what to do next. Singing Rock said, Your friend, is he all right? One of the reporters, a short, stocky man in a plum-colored shirt and heavy glasses, said, Sure, he's still with the doctors, but they say he's going to be okay. Say, listen, do you know what the hell's going on here? Is this true about evil spirits? Singing Rock ignored his questions. Is your friend prone to fits? He asked intently. The TV reporter shook his head slowly. Never saw him have one before. This is the first time, far as I know. He never said he was an epileptic or anything like that. Singing Rock looked grave. Was anyone else looking through a camera at the same time? He asked. The TV reporter said, No, sir, we only have this one camera here. Say, do you know what that terrible smell is? Singing Rock said, May I? And lifted the portable television camera out of its case. It was dented where the falling cameraman had dropped it, but it was still working. One of the technicians, a dour man in blue denim, showed him how to heft it onto his shoulder and how to look through the viewfinder. The floor of the room began to tremble and pulsate like someone shaking in fright. The lights dimmed again, and the sound of that gruesome wind grew steadily louder. There was a panicky babble from the 20 or 30 doctors and police and reporters crowded into the room, and Dr. Winsome, ashen-faced and sweating, finally had to leave his clamoring internal phones off the hook. We didn't dare to think what was happening in other wards and offices, and we couldn't get to them now if we did. Lieutenant Marino was still hanging on to the phone, waiting to hear from his reinforcements, but he had given up any semblance of optimism. He chain-smoked, and his face was set hard and grim. As the floor spasm passed, Singing Rock pressed his eye to the black rubber socket of the television camera's viewfinder, switched it on, and slowly began to scan the room. He covered it in careful, systematic sweeps, exploring every corner and behind every door. The CBS crewman watched uneasily as he circled the room, bent forward like a water diviner, his thin body tense. "What the hell's that guy up to?" said one of the technicians suspiciously. "Shh," said his colleague. "Maybe he's trying to find out where the smell comes from." After a few minutes of careful searching, Singing Rock laid the camera down. He beckoned me across and spoke to me in a low, hurried murmur so that nobody else could hear. "I think I know what happened," he muttered. "The demons which always accompany the great old one have passed through here. They are gone now, probably down to the 10th floor to gather around Miss Quamacus, but I believe the cameraman saw them." "He saw them? How?" "You know the old story the Indians believed they should never be photographed because cameras would steal their spirits from them? Well, in a manner of speaking, that was correct. A camera lens, even though it can never steal a man's Manitou, can perceive it. That is why there have been so many strange pictures in which ghosts, unseen when the picture was being taken, have mysteriously appeared when the picture is printed up." I coughed. "You mean the cameraman saw these demons through the viewfinder? That's why he collapsed?" "I think so," said Singing Rock. "We'd better go and talk to him if he's still conscious. If he can tell us which demons he saw, we may be able to work out when the great old one is due to make his appearance." We called Jack Hughes over and explained what was going on. He said nothing, but nodded in agreement when Singing Rock suggested speaking to the cameraman. He had a brief word with Dr. Winsome, and then he beckoned us through to the first aid room. It was silent in there. On a high hospital couch, the cameraman lay pallid and twitching, while 3 doctors kept a close watch on his pulse rate and other vital signs. They greeted Jack Hughes as he came in and stood aside to let us gather round the cameraman's bed. "Don't be too rough with him," said one of the interns. "He's had a bad shock, and he's not up to much." Singing Rock didn't answer. He leaned over the white-faced cameraman and whispered, "Can you hear me? Can you hear what I'm saying?" The cameraman simply shuddered. Singing Rock said again, "Can you hear what I'm saying? Do you understand where you are?" There was no response. The interns shrugged, and one of them said, "He's deeply unconscious, I'm afraid. Whatever it was that happened to him, his mind has kind of retreated, and it isn't coming back out for anyone. It's quite common in severe shock cases. Give him time." Under his breath, Singing Rock said, "We don't have time." He fished in his coat pocket for a necklace of strangely painted beads, and he gently laid them on the cameraman's head like a halo. One of the interns tried to protest, but Jack Hughes waved him away. With his eyes closed, Singing Rock began an incantation. I couldn't hear the words at all, and those which I could hear were in Sioux. At least I presumed it was Sioux. I'm not a linguist myself, and for all I know it could have been French. The spell didn't seem to work at first. The cameraman remained pale and still, his fingers occasionally twitching and his lips moving soundlessly. But then Singing Rock drew a magic figure in the air over his head, and without any warning at all, the cameraman's eyes blinked open. They looked glassy and ill-focused, but they were actually open. "Now," said Singing Rock gently, "what did you see, my friend, through your camera?" The cameraman shuddered, and there were bubbles of saliva at the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man dying from rabies, or in the terminal stages of syphilis. Something so terrible was imprinted on his mind that there was nothing he could do to exorcise it from his memory. He couldn't even die. It's, he stuttered. "Come on, my friend," said Singing Rock. "I bid you to speak. It will not get thee. Gitche Manitou will protect thee." The cameraman closed his eyes. I thought for a moment that he had dropped back into unconsciousness, but after a few seconds, he began to speak, very quickly and almost unintelligibly, in a wordy rush. It swam, it was swimming, it came swimming across the room and through the room at the same time, and I caught a glimpse of just the edge of it like a sort of squid, with waving arms, all waving, but it was big as well. I can't say how big it was. I was so frightened. There was something inside my head, like my whole brain was stolen. Only a glimpse, though, just a glimpse. Singing Rock listened for a while longer, but the cameraman said nothing more. He carefully removed the beads from the man's head and said, "Well, that seems to be it." "Is he okay?" I asked. "I mean, he's not—" "No," said Singing Rock. "He's not dead. I don't think he'll ever be the same again, but he's not dead." "The squid," I said. "Do you know what that was?" Singing Rock said, "Yes. This man was privileged to see something that has been banished from the earth for centuries. He didn't see all of it, which is probably just as well. The great old one is among us again." Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Manitou by Graham Masterton. Be sure to join us next week as we read the final chapter. And be sure to visit our merchandise store at thehiddencorners.com. Have a great week, everyone.